February 15, 1942. The Ford Motor Factory in Singapore. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, commander of British forces in Malaya, walks stiffly toward a table where Japanese Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita waits. Percival's uniform is rumpled, his face drawn with exhaustion and defeat. Behind him, the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore is burning. Ahead lies the unthinkable, the surrender of 85,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops to a Japanese force less than half their size. For 80 years, Singapore had been the cornerstone of British power in the Far East. Its massive naval base was the largest in the British Empire, designed to project dominance across Southeast Asia. The island fortress boasted enormous coastal guns, modern airfields, and seemingly impenetrable defenses. Churchill had called it the Gibraltar of the East. British propaganda declared it could hold out for months, even years. Military planners assured London that Singapore was invincible. Yet in just 70 days, from the first Japanese landings in northern Malaya to this moment of surrender, the entire defensive strategy had collapsed. The impregnable fortress had fallen with shocking speed. A numerically inferior Japanese force, advancing through supposedly impassable jungle on bicycles and captured vehicles, had shattered the myth of British invincibility in Asia. The Union Jack was about to be lowered, replaced by the rising sun. Winston Churchill would later call it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. The fall of Singapore shattered British prestige throughout Asia, exposed the hollow nature of colonial military power, and demonstrated that the age of European dominance in the East was ending. It was a defeat so complete, so humiliating, and so consequential that its reverberations would shape the post-war world. This is the story of how the fortress fell, a tale of arrogance and complacency, strategic miscalculation, operational incompetence, and the brutal effectiveness of Japanese military doctrine. It is the story of 138,000 men who became prisoners of war, and the civilians who suffered under 3.5 years of brutal occupation. It is the story of Britain's darkest hour in the East. Singapore's strategic importance was obvious. Located at the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula, the island controlled the sea lanes between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Any power holding Singapore could dominate trade routes connecting India, China, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. For Britain, maintaining its global empire, Singapore was indispensable. Construction of the massive naval base began in 1923 and continued through the 1930s. The facility was enormous, the largest dry dock in the world, capable of servicing the entire British Eastern Fleet. Repair facilities, fuel storage, ammunition dumps, and barracks covered square miles. The guns protecting the naval base were equally impressive, 15-inch naval rifles capable of sinking any warship that dared approach. These massive guns, mounted in concrete emplacements, could fire shells weighing nearly a ton over distances exceeding 20 miles. The defenses appeared formidable. The coastal guns covered the sea approaches. The Royal Air Force maintained airfields at Sembuang, Seletar, Tengah, and Kallang, with supposedly adequate fighter strength to repel air attacks. The narrow Johor Strait separating Singapore Island from the Malayan mainland was just 600 yards wide, easily defended, or so planners believed. Military engineers assured London that the fortress could hold out indefinitely against any conceivable attack. But the defenses contained fatal flaws that would prove catastrophic. The massive coastal guns, designed to sink warships, were largely useless against land attacks. Most could not traverse to fire northward at land targets. Even those that could were supplied primarily with armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate ship hulls, not high-explosive rounds effective against infantry and fortifications. The myth that the guns pointed the wrong way is an oversimplification, but the reality was almost as bad. They were the wrong weapons for the threat that actually materialized. Air defenses were inadequate. The RAF had fewer than 200 aircraft in Malaya and Singapore, many obsolete. The Brewster Buffalo fighters were slow and poorly armed compared to Japanese Zeros. Bomber strength was minimal. Radar coverage was limited. When Japanese forces landed in northern Malaya, the RAF was immediately overwhelmed and driven from airfield after airfield. Perhaps most critically, British planners had convinced themselves that attack from the north through the Malayan jungles was impossible. The jungle was impenetrable. No army could advance through it, especially not with heavy equipment and supplies. Any attack would come from the sea, where the coastal guns and naval power would destroy it. This assumption, repeated so often it became accepted truth, would prove disastrously wrong. The garrison itself reflected Britain's imperial overstretch. The troops defending Malaya and Singapore included British regulars, Indian army units of varying quality, Australian brigades, and locally recruited forces. Training was inadequate. Coordination between units was poor. Many Indian army units had been hastily expanded with undertrained recruits. The Australians, though capable fighters, were unfamiliar with jungle warfare. Leadership at multiple levels ranged from competent to dangerously incompetent. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding the Japanese 25th Army, approached the Malayan campaign with entirely different assumptions. Where the British saw impenetrable jungle, Yamashita saw concealment and opportunity. Where British planners expected prolonged siege warfare, Yamashita planned rapid advance and aggressive infiltration. Where the British relied on firepower and fixed defenses, Yamashita emphasized speed, maneuver, and surprise. The Japanese force totaled approximately 60,000 men in 3 divisions: the 5th Division, the 18th Division, and the Imperial Guards Division. They were outnumbered by the defenders but possessed critical advantages. Japanese troops had extensive combat experience from years of war in China. They were trained for jungle warfare, comfortable operating in terrain the British considered impassable. Their tactics emphasized infiltration, encirclement, and exploitation of weak points rather than frontal assault. Japanese air power was superior in both quality and quantity. The Zero fighter outclassed everything the RAF had in theater. Japanese pilots were experienced and aggressive. Close air support doctrine was well developed. When the campaign began, Japanese aircraft would quickly achieve air superiority, strafing convoys, bombing airfields, and terrorizing defenders. Most critically, Yamashita understood the psychological dimension of warfare. His strategy aimed not just to defeat British forces, but to shatter their confidence and will to resist. Rapid advances, aggressive infiltration, and relentless pressure would create panic and collapse. British commanders, expecting methodical siege warfare, would be mentally and organizationally unprepared for the speed and ferocity of Japanese operations. The war in Malaya began hours after Pearl Harbor. On December 8, 1941, Japanese forces landed at Kota Baru on Malaya's northeastern coast and at 2 locations in southern Thailand. The landings achieved complete surprise despite warnings that Japanese convoys had been spotted approaching. Within hours, Japanese troops were ashore and advancing. The RAF attempted to interdict the landings but suffered devastating losses. Japanese fighters shot down obsolete British bombers with ease. Within days, the RAF had lost air superiority. Japanese aircraft ranged freely over Malaya, attacking ground forces, convoys, and airfields. One by one, RAF bases were evacuated or overrun. On December 10, disaster struck at sea. The battleship HMS Prince of Wales and battlecruiser HMS Repulse, sent to disrupt Japanese operations, were attacked by Japanese naval bombers. Both capital ships were sunk in a matter of hours, the first time in history that modern warships had been sunk by air attack while underway and defending themselves. The loss shocked the world and demonstrated that air power now dominated naval warfare. British naval superiority in Asian waters evaporated. With air and sea control lost, the ground campaign became a desperate fighting retreat. Japanese forces advanced down both coasts of the Malay Peninsula, infiltrating through jungle the British had declared impassable. Time and again, British units prepared defensive positions, only to find Japanese troops appearing on their flanks or rear, having moved through terrain supposedly impossible to traverse. The Japanese employed bicycles extensively, a detail that later became famous. Troops cycled down roads and paths, covering enormous distances with speed and minimal logistics. When bridges were destroyed, soldiers carried their bicycles across rivers and continued. The image of Japanese troops cycling through the jungle became symbolic of the campaign, an unsophisticated but devastatingly effective solution that British planners had never anticipated. British and Commonwealth forces fought numerous rearguard actions, but the pattern was consistent. Japanese forces would engage frontally while sending infiltration units through the jungle to attack flanks and rear. British commanders, fearing encirclement, would order withdrawal. The retreat became perpetual, each defensive line abandoned before it could be properly established. The Indian Army units suffered particularly badly. Many were new formations with limited training. Officers were often inexperienced. When Japanese troops infiltrated their positions, entire battalions disintegrated. The 11th Indian Division, for example, was virtually destroyed as an effective fighting force within weeks of the campaign's start. Australian units generally fought more effectively, but they too were forced into continuous retreat by the relentless Japanese advance. The 8th Australian Division fought savage battles at Gemmas and Muar, inflicting significant casualties on Japanese forces. But tactical victories meant nothing when the strategic situation required constant withdrawal. By January 1942, the situation had become dire. Japanese forces had advanced hundreds of miles, capturing airfield after airfield, defeating every attempt to establish a defensive line. The British retreat was becoming a rout. Morale was collapsing. Units were becoming disorganized. Equipment was being abandoned. The supposedly methodical fighting withdrawal was degenerating into panic. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, overall commander, struggled to control the deteriorating situation. His strategy of fighting successive rearguard actions had failed to slow the Japanese advance meaningfully. Each defensive position was abandoned after brief contact. The planned withdrawal to a strong defensive line never materialized because no line held long enough to establish proper defenses. The civilian population fled southward ahead of the advancing Japanese forces. Roads became clogged with refugees, military vehicles, and retreating troops. The chaos made organized defense even more difficult. Japanese aircraft strafed the columns mercilessly, adding to the panic. On January 31, 1942, the last British forces crossed the causeway connecting the mainland to Singapore Island. Engineers blew a gap in the causeway, a symbolic gesture that did little to impede Japanese forces. The retreat that began in northern Malaya 60 days earlier had reached its final destination. All British and Commonwealth forces were now compressed onto Singapore Island itself. The situation was desperate. Approximately 85,000 combat troops crowded the island, along with tens of thousands of non-combatants, support personnel, and civilians. Supplies were limited. Water was becoming critical. Singapore's water supply came largely from reservoirs on the mainland, now in Japanese hands. Morale was shattered. Units were disorganized. Many soldiers had been in continuous combat or retreat for 2 months. Percival's plan was to defend the entire coastline of the island, approximately 70 miles of perimeter. This dispersion meant weakness everywhere. Japanese forces could concentrate overwhelming strength at any chosen point, while British forces, spread thin, could not mass reserves quickly enough to counter penetrations. General Yamashita had driven his forces hard during the advance down Malaya. Now, facing the final obstacle, he faced his own challenges. Japanese forces had suffered significant casualties. Ammunition was running low. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles. Yamashita had perhaps 30,000 combat-effective troops for the assault, outnumbered nearly 3-1 by the defenders. But Yamashita understood that morale and momentum were more important than raw numbers. He ordered immediate preparation for assault. Japanese artillery, positioned on the mainland, began bombarding the island. The shelling was intensive but lasted only a few days. Ammunition supplies were limited. On the night of February 8, Japanese forces launched their assault across the Johor Strait. The attack focused on the northwestern coast, defended by the 22nd Australian Brigade. Japanese troops crossed in boats and on makeshift rafts, supported by artillery and air attacks. The assault achieved complete surprise. Percival had expected the attack to come from the northeast. The Australian defenders fought fiercely, but Japanese forces established beachheads and poured troops across the strait. By dawn on February 9, thousands of Japanese soldiers were ashore and advancing inland. Attempts to mount counterattacks failed due to confusion, poor communications, and the speed of the Japanese advance. Over the next days, Japanese forces expanded their lodgment, fighting house to house in the western suburbs of Singapore City. British and Commonwealth forces attempted to contain the penetration, but lacked the coordination and reserves to mount an effective counteroffensive. Japanese troops continued infiltrating through swamps and plantations that British commanders had assumed were impassable. The civilian situation became catastrophic. Singapore City was under constant artillery bombardment and air attack. Thousands of civilians crowded into inadequate shelters. Casualties mounted. The medical system was overwhelmed. Water supplies were compromised when Japanese forces seized the reservoirs. Food was running short. By February 13, Japanese forces controlled much of western Singapore and were advancing on the city center. Percival's commanders reported that organized resistance was collapsing. Many units had disintegrated. Thousands of soldiers had abandoned their positions and crowded into the city, seeking safety that did not exist. Percival faced an impossible choice. Churchill had cabled from London ordering that Singapore fight to the last man, that surrender was unthinkable. But the military situation was hopeless. Water supplies would be exhausted within days. Ammunition was nearly gone. Further resistance would only increase civilian casualties without changing the outcome. On February 15, 1942, Percival made the decision to surrender. He and his staff drove to the Ford Motor Factory, where General Yamashita waited. The scene was humiliating. A haggard British general surrendering the supposedly impregnable fortress to a Japanese commander whose forces were outnumbered, low on supplies, and at the end of long and vulnerable supply lines. Yamashita, later asked about the surrender negotiations, admitted he had been bluffing. Japanese forces were nearly exhausted. Ammunition was critically low. If Percival had ordered continued resistance, Yamashita's forces might not have been able to continue the assault. But Percival did not know this. Deceived by Japanese aggressiveness and the speed of their advance, convinced that further resistance was futile, he signed the surrender document. The surrender delivered approximately 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops into Japanese captivity, the largest surrender in British military history. Thousands of civilians also came under Japanese control. What followed was 3.5 years of brutal occupation and imprisonment. Japanese treatment of prisoners of war was harsh beyond what international law or common humanity required. Prisoners were crowded into Changi Prison and other camps with inadequate food, water, and medical care. Many were forced to work on the infamous Burma-Thailand Railway, the Death Railway, where tens of thousands died from overwork, starvation, disease, and brutality. The Changi experience and the horrors of the railway became seared into Australian and British national consciousness. Civilians under Japanese occupation suffered similarly. Food shortages, arbitrary violence, forced labor, and repressive controls made daily life a struggle for survival. The Chinese population of Singapore suffered particularly badly. Japanese forces conducted systematic massacres targeting ethnic Chinese perceived as sympathetic to China's resistance against Japan. The Suk Ching massacre killed an estimated 25,000 to 50,000 Chinese civilians in the weeks following Singapore's surrender. The strategic consequences of Singapore's fall rippled across the Asia-Pacific theater. With Singapore gone, Japanese forces quickly completed the conquest of the Dutch East Indies, capturing vital oil fields. Burma fell, threatening India. Australia faced the real possibility of invasion. British prestige throughout Asia, already damaged, was shattered beyond repair. The psychological impact in Britain was profound. After Dunkirk, the Battle of Britain, and the early victories in North Africa, Britons had begun to believe the worst was over. Singapore's fall demonstrated that the war was far from won, that disasters could still occur, that British power was not what propaganda claimed. Churchill faced a vote of no confidence in Parliament. He survived, but the political damage was significant. The fall of Singapore resulted from failures at every level: strategic, operational, tactical, and human. Understanding these failures illuminates not just this particular defeat, but the broader collapse of European colonial power in Asia. Strategically, British planning was fundamentally flawed. The assumption that Singapore could be defended primarily as a naval base, that the jungle provided natural protection from land attack, that air power was supplementary rather than decisive, all these assumptions proved catastrophically wrong. British planners prepared to fight the wrong war, with the wrong forces in the wrong way. The decision to send Prince of Wales and Repulse without adequate air cover was symptomatic of British failure to understand modern warfare. The two ships were sent to show the flag and deter Japanese aggression through presence. Instead, they were sunk in hours, demonstrating that Britain could not project naval power in Asian waters without air superiority, which it did not have and could not quickly achieve. Operationally, the defense of Malaya was incompetent. Percival's strategy of fighting successive rearguard actions played directly into Japanese hands, allowing Yamashita to maintain initiative and momentum. The decision to defend Singapore's entire coastline dispersed forces fatally, ensuring weakness everywhere. The failure to prepare adequate defensive positions, to organize effective counterattack forces, to maintain unit cohesion during the retreat, all these operational failures contributed to defeat. Tactically, British and Commonwealth forces were outfought. Japanese troops demonstrated superior jungle warfare skills, better small unit tactics, more aggressive leadership, and greater willingness to infiltrate and take risks. British infantry, trained for conventional warfare on open terrain, struggled in the jungle. Indian Army units, many hastily raised and poorly trained, collapsed under pressure. Only the Australians consistently fought effectively, and they too were worn down by continuous retreat. Leadership failures were pervasive. Percival was a capable staff officer but proved inadequate as a combat commander. He was indecisive when boldness was needed, dispersed forces when concentration was essential, and surrendered when at least some military historians believe continued resistance might have forced a Japanese withdrawal. His subordinate commanders ranged from competent to disastrous. Coordination between services was poor. Intelligence was consistently wrong. The human dimension mattered crucially. British forces, having retreated hundreds of miles, constantly bombed and strafed, seeing their defenses repeatedly outflanked, lost confidence. Many soldiers convinced themselves that Japanese troops were superhuman, able to move silently through jungle, see in the dark, survive on handfuls of rice. These beliefs, though exaggerated, became self-fulfilling. Troops who believe they face unbeatable enemies fight less effectively. Perhaps the deepest impact of Singapore's fall was psychological. The myth of European invincibility in Asia, a myth cultivated for generations, central to colonial rule, was shattered irreparably. Asian populations watching Japanese forces defeat British, Dutch, and American colonial powers drew obvious conclusions. White men were not invincible. European empires could be defeated. Colonial rule rested not on inherent superiority, but on military force, and that force could be overcome. This realization transformed Asian nationalism. Independence movements that had seemed distant possibilities became immediate objectives. When the war ended and European powers attempted to reassert colonial control, they faced populations no longer willing to accept subordination. Britain, France, and the Netherlands would fight bitter wars attempting to maintain colonies, but Singapore's fall had demonstrated that the era of European dominance was ending. For Japan, Singapore's capture was the pinnacle of early war success. Within 4 months of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had conquered vast territories, defeated multiple Western powers, and established what they called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. The speed and completeness of victory seemed to validate Japanese military doctrine and imperial ambitions. But Japanese success contained the seeds of failure. Brutality toward prisoners and civilians created lasting hatreds. The vast conquered territories required enormous garrison forces and administrative resources. The facade of Asia for Asians could not hide the reality of Japanese exploitation and repression. And strategically, Japanese forces had advanced to the limits of sustainable control, creating a perimeter too vast to defend against eventual American counteroffensive. Singapore remained under Japanese occupation until September 1945, when British forces returned to accept the Japanese surrender, a deliberate symbolic gesture designed to restore British prestige. But the restoration was illusory. The world had changed. Singapore would achieve self-government and eventual independence. The British Empire in Asia was finished, though its formal end would take decades more. For those who endured Japanese captivity, liberation brought relief mixed with lasting trauma. Many prisoners of war suffered permanent physical and psychological damage. Relationships with Japanese former captors remained bitter for decades. Annual commemorations remember those who died in captivity or defending Singapore. The fall of Singapore entered British military history as a case study in how not to conduct operations. Staff colleges worldwide analyzed the campaign, teaching lessons about strategic assumptions, operational planning, and tactical execution. The failures were so comprehensive that nearly every aspect offers instructive examples of what to avoid. Singapore should not have fallen, at least not so quickly, not so completely, not to a force so inferior in numbers. Proper strategic planning, adequate preparation, competent operational execution, and determined tactical fighting could have made Singapore a far more difficult objective. Japanese forces, operating at the end of long supply lines with limited ammunition and fuel, might have been forced to withdraw or conduct a prolonged siege that would have tied down forces needed elsewhere. But should not have is the historian's luxury. What actually happened was catastrophic defeat. 70 days from first landing to final surrender, 138,000 prisoners taken, British prestige shattered, the myth of invincibility destroyed. The fortress built to last months fell in weeks. The troops outnumbering their attackers surrendered. The impregnable defenses proved hollow. Churchill's assessment was accurate. It was Britain's worst disaster. The fall of Singapore marked a turning point not just in World War II, but in world history. Colonial empires that had dominated Asia for centuries began their collapse. Asian nationalism, vindicated by Japanese victories over European powers, became an unstoppable force. The post-war world would be fundamentally different than the colonial world that existed before Singapore fell. For the 138,000 men who surrendered, for the thousands who died in captivity, for the civilians who suffered under brutal occupation, the fall of Singapore was personal tragedy. But in the larger sweep of history, it was something more. The moment when the age of European colonial dominance in Asia effectively ended, when the illusion of invincibility shattered, when the future became clear to those willing to see it. The guns of Singapore, pointed seaward, waiting for a naval attack that never came, remain a symbol of strategic myopia, preparing for the wrong war with the wrong assumptions against an enemy who did the unexpected. And the fortress that fell in 70 days remains a warning across the decades. Assumptions untested, defenses unprepared, and leadership inadequate will lead to disaster, no matter how strong the fortifications appear on paper.